No. Okay, guys, I can see people starting to join, so I'm going to get going. I've had a series of questions already come in about the memory topic area, so I'm going to get moving as quick as I can with those because I've got quite a lot to get through. So starting from the very beginning, I had a couple of requests from, I think it was Joe Kirkbright wanted to refresh some of the memory research. I've had a request from Emily to just go through how to structure an essay on the multi-star model, stuff about working memory model, eyewitness testimony. So yeah, I'm going to jump straight in and do a little bit of a refresher on memory research. So I'll start with multi-star to begin with. If you look in your booklets for the multi-star model, there is, we've kind of given you 4 key studies, experimental pieces of research. I think that's the first thing that you need to realise, that to evaluate the multi-star model of memory and also the working memory model, you need to have a combination of both experimental research and case study research, because they counteract one another. So the criticisms of experimental research are then made up for by case study research, but then they've got the flaws as well. So the reason why we give you both of those sources of evidence is because there's some real good methodology comments to come out of it. So the experimental research studies that you need to know really as a priority are Baddeley, Peterson and Peterson, and the Barrick piece of research. Now there's also Glanzer and Kunitz in there as well, but I think that's the one that would be the bottom of the priority list in terms of what it shows us, and also it tends to be the more difficult one to describe from a student perspective, because not really many people understand how to use it correctly. So the Baddeley research to begin with is the one that's the lengthiest to describe. So the Baddeley research is to do with encoding. Obviously, one of the first things that you get taught, and one of the first things that you'd need to say if you were describing the multi-star model, is that each star within memory encodes material in a different manner. So obviously sensory register is modality specific depending on where the information is coming from. Short-term memory is acoustic, and it's vulnerable to acoustic confusion. So things that sound the same are often muddled up and forgotten. And then long-term memory operates on semantic encoding. So that's what the Baddeley research was investigating. It was trying to see whether or not there is semantic and acoustic confusion occurring, and then he used that as evidence to show that that's how we encode into short-term and long-term memories. So there were 4 conditions. You had 2 in relation to acoustic processing or encoding, and 2 in relation to semantic encoding. So the first 2 were to do with acoustic encoding. So the first condition was words that sounded the same. Second condition were words that sounded dissimilar. I think it was that way around. And then you just need to basically say that they were presented with those words. The task for the participants was to put the words in order that they'd seen them, but that there's a 20-minute delay in the middle of being presented them and then the recall task. So when the words sounded the same, recall was below 10% in that condition. So that implied that there was some sort of acoustic confusion taking place. In the condition rather where the words didn't sound the same, they were acoustically dissimilar, so there was no kind of like rhyming patterns or anything like that. Recall was above 80%. So that implies that when you take the acoustic kind of confusion away, then memory is much better. Same thing with the semantic conditions. So when there was semantic confusion, so the words were similar in terms of meaning, that had the lowest recall of all. So people were not able to remember it. I think recall was about 50% in that condition, maybe just a little bit above that. So that's your first piece of research. That, like I say, is the wordiest of all of them. So my recommendation to you is not use that one. If you can avoid it, I think it takes some doing to really describe that well. So I would use Peterson and Peterson and Barrick if you can get away with it. Is your bits of supporting evidence, because I think they're much more straightforward to describe. But it's up to you. Peterson and Peterson is really, really easy. So Peterson and Peterson was investigating the duration of the short-term memory. Obviously, theory had proposed at this point that the duration was approximately 20 seconds. So Peterson and Peterson investigated that by presenting trigrams to participants. You should all know that a trigram is just a random combination of letters. It has no meaning at all. Obviously, you don't want to present participants in this kind of research with anything that's meaningful, that's going to create acoustic or semantic confusion. So that's why the idea of trigrams were developed. So they presented them with these random combinations of consonants, and then it was an independent measures design. So there were 6 conditions in total, and the premise was you would show them the trigram, then each group was asked to count backwards from a different number, different starting point, and there were 6 conditions. So one group counted backwards for 3 seconds, a second group were asked to count backwards for 6 seconds, 9, 12, 15 and 18. And then it was just a free recall task to see how many of the trigrams they correctly recalled. So that procedure is really simplistic to describe. Then in terms of the findings, it was pretty much identical to the Baddeley findings. So those figures are exactly the same. So it was 80% recall for those counting backwards for 3 seconds, 10% recall for those counting backwards for 18 seconds. So Peterson and Peterson used that to support the idea that the duration is approximately 20 seconds, so somewhere between 18 and 20 seconds. The Barrick study was investigating long-term memory duration, and also the fact that you can hold on to long-term memories for potentially infinite periods of time. So that was shown by subtle differences, marginal differences in terms of the findings. So you had 400 participants in total, ranging from 17, so your kind of age range, up to about 75, 74, 75, I think was the top age range. And the task was to basically identify people that they'd been to school with. So being asked to identify faces and names from a yearbook. And in people who had left college kind of 47 years earlier, they had poorer recall. So it was, I think, about 70%, I want to say. Correct me if I'm wrong there, anybody who's got the bits in front of them. But it was, like I say, it was only a very, very marginal difference between those who had left school within the last 15 years and those who had left school nearer towards 50 years. With those findings, I will just say to you, this is why I'm a little bit ropey with them. The Barrick study is one of those weird ones where, depending on which textbook you look at, depending on which source of evidence you go with, you might get slight variation in terms of how accurate the group of participants were. But the main point that you want to get across there is that there wasn't that much of a difference in terms of how accurately they could recognise faces between people who were 75 years old and had left college nearly 50 years ago and those who had left in the last 15 years. So that's your experimental research. Now, Emily, you were asking for advice on how to write an essay on the multi-star model of memory. Anybody who I teach, you know that I'm always wittering on about this, but it's far better to take an integrated approach to writing an essay. So describing the different components and then moving over to bits of research evidence to support yourself, that is a far better strategy than just whipping out the full description of the multi-star model and then doing a block of evaluation. So I would always start with just a description of what the stars are, and then you can break away and do bits of evidence and potentially bits of evaluation and slot it in to the description of the multi-star model. And that way you're also picking up evaluation credit really, really early on, because what a lot of you will undoubtedly do is do the AO1 and describe the model in perfect detail, and then you run the risk of not including any evaluation. So that's why I always say that to my students. I know some other people don't say that, but as a seasoned examiner, I've been doing examining for years now, and I'm marking 2 papers again this year. It's fact that the students who write those integrated essays are much, much better. You don't run the risk of running out of time. You don't lose credit because you don't get round to evaluating, and it also shows really good writing skills, so being able to incorporate it. Obviously, if you can do it, it's better. If you can, and you just write blocks of AO1 and AO3, you're not going to be penalised for it as long as you can get it done. So I've got some of my best students who never integrate, but the fact remains that not everybody's going to be able to regurgitate 3 pages of information in a 20-minute time frame. So for those of you who struggle with time, you're better off going with my approach. So yeah, that's to answer your question, Hannah. No, you absolutely won't lose marks for writing it like that, but you will lose marks yourself if you don't get the essay finished. That's the whole point. That's why it's better to move some evaluation forward. So Emily, that's in reference to your question there of how to best structure that essay. Now, obviously, as well as your experimental evidence for the multi-star, you've got 3 sources of case study research that you can utilise really, really well here. And I did post something about that last night as well. So you've got 3 sources of case study, and one of them is supporting, 2 of them are criticisms. The stupid way to think about it, and this is, I promise you, this is how I always remember it. This is not just me giving you a bit of an anecdote, because I used to get them muddled up as well, and I was always struggling. So I used to think of H&M makes me feel good, all right? So going out and buying some clothes or whatever, that's good. And then KFC, KF and C, so KF and Clive Wearing is bad for you, all right? It's just a stupid way of remembering it, but that's always the way I do it. So the HM case study is basically supporting this idea that we need rehearsal in order to get information out of our short-term memory into long-term memory, because he could not form any new long-term memories. If you gave him like capacity tasks and encoding tasks, he'd be absolutely fine, but he would not be able to transfer that information through to long-term memory because he had problems with maintenance rehearsal specifically. So that's the way that one supports it. HM and Clive Wearing both criticise the very same concept. So Atkinson and Schifrin basically dropped a ball, because when they published their original model, they said that short-term memory and long-term memory were classed as unitary stars. They gave no recognition to the idea that within short-term memory there might be different little components that are doing different things. So always use that word for me. Short-term memory and long-term memory are unitary stars. So they said that all short-term memories are in one place, all long-term memories are in one place. So KF and Clive Wearing both criticise that idea. KF criticises STM being unitary. Clive Wearing criticises LTM being unitary. So with KF, it was shown that there are visual and verbal components making up the short-term memory. So KF, who had a motorbike accident, had problems recalling or forming short-term verbal memories, but he could remember visual encounters. So he had no problems remembering images and faces, but if you gave him a task which was like string digit tasking, so remembering numbers, he wouldn't be able to do it. So that therefore implied that you had two different coding systems, one for visual, one for verbal, and that led into the development of the working memory model. And then with Clive Wearing, he basically didn't lose all of his long-term memory. He lost about 90% of it, but he retained procedural memory. So the weird thing with Clive Wearing, I hope you can all remember, was that he could play the piano exceptionally well. If you stuck him in front of a choir, he'd still be able to conduct them. So he retained all the things that he could do. He retained all of his skills. In terms of things that he knew, he had no fact-based memory really to speak of. He didn't know what kind of day of the week it was, who was the Queen at the time. He had very few facts that he knew. Two things that he did know were that he had a wife and they had children, but he didn't know anything about them. So he had very, very few fact-based memories, and he had no episodic memories at all. So he knew he had a wife and he knew he had kids, but he couldn't remember getting married, and he couldn't remember anything about his children in the slightest. So so Clive Wearing implied then that there were three different kinds of long-term memories, and that if you get amnesia that is confined to your long-term memory, it doesn't mean that you will lose all long-term memories in total. That therefore implies that there must be subcomponents in operation, and if one breaks, then the other ones can remain intact. Your methodology points, obviously in relation to the experiments and the case studies, are really easy. Criticise the experiments as much as what you can for lacking in mundane realism, but as long as you apply it. So your best bet there is Peterson and Peterson, because the trigrams are just not realistic in terms of what we would do in real life. Case studies are unique circumstances. So Clive Wearing is the worst case of amnesia ever reported. Those circumstances are never ever going to repeat themselves. So the man had the herpes virus. So a lot of us will suffer the herpes virus over the course of our lifetime, normally in the form of a cold sore. What most of us won't experience is that it spreads to our brain. So that is one unique case study that you're never going to get to replicate. Therefore, you can't generalise those circumstances, and you can't say for sure that the same thing would happen if somebody else were to experience those circumstances. So that's your multi-star model, and like I say, building those points in as you go along is absolutely the best strategy there. Now, from the Clive Wearing case study, you then move in to the stuff on long-term memory. That's how it slots together in the specification. So based on Clive Wearing and other cases as well, there was the development of the three different types of long-term memory, so episodic, semantic and procedural memories. I've already kind of referenced what they are, but procedural is skill-based stuff. Episodic is episodes of your life that you have got particular relevance or meaning. They've got particular relevance or meaning to you. And then semantic is just fact-based knowledge. If you got a question on that, it's literally going to be definitions. The most common kind of example that we see on long-term memory is STEM-based questions. So a description of somebody who's practicing a number of different skills, or it's like a conversation or something like that, and you're asked to pull out what is the procedural bit, what is the episodic bit, and what is the semantic bit. So expect a kind of question of that nature, I would say, for long-term memory. For long-term memory, it could be a 16-mark essay, so there is evaluation points linked in with it. Clive Wearing in that case is now used to support this little theory. So it was used to criticise the multi-star model, but it's used to support the notion of long-term memory. So long-term memory is the theory that you have got these different components. Clive Wearing therefore supports that you do, and you would just use it in exactly the same way as what we've just already mentioned. There is, however, a new kind of evidence that we've not spoken about yet, which is brain scan evidence. So you can utilise PET scan research and fMRI research, which all indicates the same thing, that when you're practicing different kinds of long-term memory, different parts of your memory light up as being active. So procedural memory is typically located in the cerebellum, so located right in the back of your brain. The episodic memory is typically located in the hippocampus, and then the semantic memory is also located in a part of your brain, a central part of your brain known as the temporal lobe. So the hippocampus is partially located in the temporal lobe as well. So yeah, so procedural memory mainly cerebellum, episodic is hippocampus and temporal lobes, and semantic is definitely temporal lobes. So you can utilise those findings as well if you get an essay question on long-term memory. And then it's just the same criticism of case studies. That criticism there, as long as you learn it, you can keep using that till the cows come home. Same with the mundane realism point. All of this research is cognitive research, which is conducted in a lab, and it can be flawed in the exact same way, that the tasks are just really artificial, and they're supposed to be explaining how our memories work, but very few of the studies actually show memory in real life. So for example, the Barrick study you wouldn't be able to criticise as being low in mundane realism, because that is what we do, we recognise faces and names from our past, but most of the other studies are very, very artificial in their nature. Speaking of tasks being artificial in their nature, I'm going to go through onto the working memory model next. So for those of you who are watching and wanted to recap multi-star model, is there anything else that you want to ask there? Specific styles of questions or anything that you think I've not explained clearly enough? Yeah, just give me a heads up now, please, those of you who are watching. If we're good to move on to working memory, just give me a thumbs up, because I don't want to like leave you hanging, and make sure that you understood everything that I've said. So just give me a bit of an indication, please, as to whether or not we're ready to go on to working memory model now. Okay, right, that's several people saying that they're all right there with multi-star. What was the question on working memory model or the year? Are you talking about I think you might be talking about the driving question, Lauren. Is that right? Just tell me whether or not that's the one that you mean, and then I'll explain to you how that question should have worked. There has been an essay question on working memory model, but yeah, it was a stimulus question. Anyway, I'll move on to working memory model, and if anybody wants me to go through that question with you about the driving scenario, then I will do at the end. So working memory model was developed. Is that the driving question with Bob and procedural memory? Yeah, that's the one that I've got in my mind. So I'll go through the model, and then I'll talk to you about that question, because it did cause some problems when it came up. So working memory model was developed in response to the criticisms of the multi-star model. So multi-star model was quite limited in terms of what it said about capacity and capability, rather, of our short-term memory. Obviously, Atkinson and Shiffrin underestimated just how capable our short-term memory was. So they instead came up, Baddeley and Hitch, with the idea or the term working memory. And they said that rather than having a unitary store buried within our short-term memories is several working components that are all active at the same time and perfectly capable of processing different types of information alongside one another. So that's where the original idea of dual processing comes from. So if you get a question on working memory, please make sure that you are using that phrase, because that is their key phrase. That was the key thing that made them, Baddeley and Hitch, different to Atkinson and Shiffrin. This idea of dual processing, that you are capable, everybody is absolutely capable of cognitive multitasking. So you can do a verbal and a visual task without cognitive overload. So once they'd hit on this premise of cognitive multitasking, so dual processing, they then set about describing the active components within our working memories. So that's where the notion of the slave systems come from. So you've got one central component, which is the executive. So the central executive has actually got a really limited capacity. Make sure that you say that in any questions. It doesn't actually do anything with the material, so it doesn't format the material in any sense. It processes what's coming in, so it recognizes the type of information that you're trying to deal with, and then it's basically a delegatory system. So it monitors and coordinates what kind of information you're dealing with. It will send off that information over to the slave systems, but it will also prioritize things for you. So the central executive, it doesn't actually deal with the information. It doesn't format it for you in any way, shape or form, but it is a very important mechanism because it prioritizes and it delegates what needs to be dealt with there and then, and it'll put things in order for you. Also, and they added this on at the very end, but the central executive works really closely with, I'm making it sound like the colleagues or something, but if you think about them as like components that work together, the central executive works very closely with the episodic buffer. So the central executive will obviously recognise when the slaves are overloaded, and anything that can't be dealt with initially and straight away will go into the temporary holdage system, which is your episodic buffer. You get a sense of priority and time and organisation within your episodic buffer, so things get kind of lined up. You know, like when you make yourself little to-do notes and to-do lists, which is what I do at work. That's your episodic buffer. It's basically a cognitive to-do list. So things that you can't do right there and then, they get put into the episodic buffer in a sequential order of what you need to deal with next, what is the next priority, and then you will kind of touch on those as and when that you can deal with them. All right. So when cognitive space is freed up in the slaves, that's what your episodic buffer's for. So visual information, you should all know, is dealt with by the Visuospatial Sketchpad. It is Visuospatial, so not Visual Spatial Sketchpad, Visuospatial Sketchpad, and that's split up into the visual cache and the InnerScribe. So the visual cache, or cache if you're not feeling posh, all right, but I always call it visual cache. So the visual cache is basically a storage system for colours and shapes. And your InnerScribe, if you imagine what a scribe does, is it writes stuff down, it describes things. So that's what your InnerScribe does. It describes what things look like, where things are in relation to one another. So how far away is that door from your hand? So how far do you need to reach out your hand to get that door handle, etc., etc. It gives you a sense of spatial reasoning. So whereas visual cache is just a recognition system, the inner scribe is telling you about how to deal with the spatial information around you and navigate your way around it accordingly. So that you can see that is a massive part of working memory, because we're all navigating our way around visual information all of the time. Auditory information is dealt with by the phonological loop. So put your teeth in, because you've got two different bits within the phonological loop. You've got the phonological store, which is your inner ear, which can hold sounds for about 2 seconds, and then you've got the articulatory control process, or the articulatory control loop, which basically your phonological store will hold a sound. It'll keep it ringing in there for a very, very brief period of time, and then your articulatory control loop is what converts it to like spoken language. It'll allow you to process a sound and then potentially like respond accordingly. So for example, when you're having a conversation with someone, both of those bits of your phonological loop are working in tandem to allow you to hear the sound, recognize it, store it, process it, and then reply with spoken language. So they're your two slave systems. Both the slave systems are capable of operating on the same at the same time. So watching a film is a perfect example of dual processing. It's visual and it's verbal information all being dealt with at once, but both of them have got exceedingly limited capacities, so you can't deal with any more than one visual bit of information and any more than one bit of verbal information at any one time. They will be overloaded. Your inner eye is the visual cache, Hannah. It's just seeing things. Yeah? But the visuospatial sketchpad is sometimes known as just the inner eye. All right? But I wouldn't use those words if I were you. Get used to using the proper technical terms. I mean, you can use inner eye and inner ear if you want, but they're kind of like the layman's terms. I would use the proper words if you can. Absolutely try to do that. They've both of the slaves have got really, really limited capacities. It's what we call cognitive overloading. So once you've got 2 bits of verbal information or 2 bits of visual information at any one time, your capacity is exceeded, and that's why you're going to find it cognitively very, very difficult to deal with that, and one will go on the back burner. One will go into the episodic buffer to be dealt with later, or it'll just be eliminated from your working memory and you won't be able to recall it. So that's basically the description. If I could give you a bit of advice with the working memory, describe it as a process. So describe it as information coming into your central executive, and then what the central executive does, and then it being sent off to one of the slave systems, going into the episodic buffer, and then being transferred to the long-term memory. It works better that way. To describe it as a process sounds a lot better than it does just describing the individual components. In terms of working memory research, you can bring in KF again, but you're obviously utilising it differently now, because KF supports the working memory model, where it's previously been used to criticise Multistar, because it's showing obviously the 2 different kinds of memory, so visual and verbal. He had a broken phonological loop but an intact visuospatial sketchpad. In terms of the experimental evidence for the working memory model, the main one that I would stick to, because it's really, really easy, is the dual processing task by Baddeley. So the visual tracking task at the same time as the verbal reasoning. So giving people verbal reasoning tasks such as, in a sequence of A, B, B, A, does A come before B in the first 2 letters? And they had to do those quite fast. That at the same time as tracking a moving light around a screen. And obviously the findings are really quite straightforward, that you were perfectly capable of doing the verbal reasoning task at the same time as tracking the light. But then when they added in a second visual task, which was visualizing the angles of a capital letter H or the capital letter F and moving around them in your head and saying what the angles were, then people obviously couldn't do those two visual tasks at the same time. I always explain it like this. The reason why you can't do that is because when you get given that task of imagining the angles of a letter H or an F, your instinctive response is to try and close your eyes, and you kind of do it. If you did that, or if I did that, you'd see my eyeballs kind of moving round as I try to do those angles. Now, obviously, as I'm trying to do that, I can't bloody follow a moving object on a screen. So that's why you can't do two visual objects at the same time. So it shows dual processing and the fact that both of the slaves are limited. Now, I think that's Philippa. Can you go over some research-based questions on memory, please? I don't know what you mean by that. So can you give me a more specific example, please? Because it's too vague. I don't know what you want me to do there. So I'll just keep moving on, Philippa, if you just tell me kind of what you want in at that point. With working memory model, it's the same criticisms. It's mundane realism, low in mundane realism. Just kind of keep going with that point about it being artificial. Same criticism of case studies. But then the only difference is that you've got a practical applications point, which is really, really nice. It's a really nifty, neat point to include here, and not a lot of people use it, and it's so good, and you can say so much about it. And it's the fact that working memory research has made massive practical applications in the classroom. So for yourselves, people who have got ADD and dyslexia can't deal with kind of visual and verbal information in the same way as what I don't want to say the word normal, but somebody of normal cognitive capacities can. And that has therefore led to classroom support for those individuals, and teachers now have awareness of that and should aid students and should try and support students. Right, like what could we get asked research method wise, like what has been on there previously? Would there be that sign test thing? Right, again, I still cannot say what kind of questions they could ask you about research methods. I've got no idea what research methods questions they could give you about memory. It could be anything. It could literally be anything. Just off the top of my head, I would say potentially types of experiment, experimental designs, order effects, demand characteristics, random allocation, sampling techniques, standardizing procedures, consent forms, debrief forms. Could there be a sign test thing? Yeah, you could get a sign test question on memory tests. So did people get better or worse in a second condition when they've got music or no music, when it was words that sounded similar, when it was words that sounded the same, and you'd have to perform a sign test. I think I did that with somebody the other day. They came to ask me about how to do a sign test. Moving through the rest of research methods content, investigator effects, other extraneous variables, reliability, external reliability, internal reliability, ecological validity, mundane realism. It could be anything. And I mean, I maybe should know this, but what research methods questions have been up regarding memory before? I don't know them. I can't remember them. There's been that many. So I'm really sorry that I can't be more specific with that, but I don't know what they could ask you because it is so vast. They could make anything work for memory. Is sign test where you add each sign and then take the smallest from the biggest? Yes, it is. but just be mindful that when they're giving you a signed test to do, they'll give you the rule. So whether or not you're taking the first condition from the second condition or vice versa, but they will always give you that rule. They'll tell you which way the sign needs to be calculated. So you add up the signs, you figure out, remember how many pluses there are, how many minuses there are. So how many people got better in the second condition, how many people got worse in the second condition. You then eliminate whoever has stayed the same because they're not credit worthy. They're basically, their data is pointless. It doesn't tell us anything about the direction of change. So you work. Yep, you do. That's what I was just saying, Philippa. You ignore the results that stay the same, and that then will leave you with N, number of participants' data that you are interested in. So number of pluses, number of minuses, you work out how many in total you've got, and then the S value, your sign value, is whichever is the less frequently occurring sign. So if, for example, you had 10 people who had got better, so that's 10 pluses, 9 people who had got worse, so that's 10 minuses, your S value would be 9. Yep. So minus is the less commonly occurring sign, so S value would be 9. Okay, and then you just go ahead in the same manner that you would always do with interpreting significance. How do you calculate DF for these tests? So DF is only for a chi-square, Hannah. You don't need to calculate DF for anything else. Typically, what do you mean? Oh my God, I don't know what you mean. Lauren, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? Oh my God, I don't get what you're saying. Oh yeah, I'm confused. Can you tell me what you mean? I don't know. I don't get what you're so shocked by me explaining a sign test. Anyway, I'm just going to answer Hannah's question. Degrees of freedom. It's only for a chi-square. Right. As in, is that why it's called a sign test? Yes. Because you're dealing with signs, pluses and minuses. Right. And anyway, Hannah, I will answer your question. Degrees of freedom for a chi-square. You're basically just looking at the number of rows and number of columns of data that you are dealing with, okay? So chi-square, because it's nominal data, always will generate a table of data which will have built into it rows and columns, okay? So other than your totals columns, you will need to basically add up how many. Oh, just bear with me a second. I'm trying to balance my wine. All right. So so you would add up the number of rows that you've got of data that you're contending with, and add up the number of columns of data that you're contending with. It is normally 2 by 2, I would say, as well. And then it's basically number of columns minus 1 times by number of rows minus 1. So if you add a 2 by 2 table, so 2 columns, 2 rows, it would be 2 minus 1, which is 1, and 2 minus 1, which is 1. So your degrees of freedom is 1 times 1. DF in that study with 2 rows, 2 columns is 1. If that makes sense. Okay, so it's always just exclude your totals, all right, from you, whatever your data table is. How many rows have you got? How many columns have you got? Total them up, minus 1, and then times them by one another, and that will give you your DF. Okay. Right. Anything else on working memory? We seem to be asking a lot about research methods. Obviously, I know that I'm going to be talking more about research methods this weekend, but anything else in terms of research methods, stuff that you want to ask here? Right, good. As long as that makes sense, Hannah, that's all we want. And I cannot believe that for a few people that is finally a light bulb moment of why it's called a sign test. Yeah, no, that's what I mean, Philippa. The DF calculation, you don't include the headings. That's what I mean by the totals. So the totals would be the ones that get excluded. But your headings, you won't be counting either. Your headings, it's not that you're not counting them because they're the labels on the end. But yeah, it's just your total. So for example, the one that's in the booklet is boys and girls, and it's different kinds of toys, isn't it? So I can't remember, like cars and dolls or something. So males, females is 2 columns, cars and dolls is 2 rows, and that's it. Any more before I move on to eyewitness testimony? That is the next thing that I've had a question about. Can you just do the same as with multi-star, please, and just give me some indication when we're ready to move on? Because I'm conscious that I need to try and get everything done. Anything else that you want to ask? Working memory based. Oh, that question. Forgot, and nobody's reminded me. Right, so that driving question was a horrible question. So it was about Bob and somebody else. I don't know, Bob and Barry, who were both driving a car. So Bob, I think, is the one who has been driving for like 5 years or something stupid. And then let's say Barry, because I can't remember the other guy's name. Barry's learning to drive. Right, so Bob has been driving for, let's say, 5 years, okay? So Bob's driving ability is not actually being processed by the working memory, okay? Bob's driving ability is now a procedural memory, which is a skill. And what you should, Brian, thank you. All right, I knew it were something else beginning with a B. But yeah, so Bob... what you should remember from long-term memory is that procedural memories, skill-based memories, don't require cognitive awareness, all right? They don't require conscious thought and conscious effort to do. So I know obviously for you lot who have recently passed your driving test and you're kind of in the infancy of driving, you still have to think a lot about when you're driving. But when you've been driving for a long time, so for example, I've been past my test 18 years this year, so I don't think when I'm driving. I obviously recognise stuff as I'm driving along, but driving to me is instinctive. It's a procedural thing that I don't have to think about. So that for that stimulus with Bob, that's what you would need to say. That for Bob, the driving ability is a procedural skill, which therefore means that his working memory has now got cognitive room to deal with 2 further tasks. So I think the tasks are that he can concentrate on the road and he can also listen to music. Let me just answer this quickly. Right, declarative and non-declarative. Non-declarative, Hannah, is the one that I've just been speaking about. So non-declarative memory means you don't have to put conscious effort into recalling it. So procedural memories are non-declarative. Whereas episodic and semantic memories are declarative. You need to declare them to the front of your mind and put cognitive effort into it. Okay, hope that makes sense. So anyway, back to Bob and Brian. So Bob, you say that it's a procedural memory, so he doesn't have to put conscious effort into driving. Therefore, his working memory is freed up, and he can carry out a visual task, looking out the window and being aware of the hazards around him, and also listening to music. Whereas with Brian, he is becoming cognitively overloaded because he is not yet at the point where driving is a procedural non-declarative skill. He has got to concentrate and put all of his cognitive capacity into focusing on the road outside, focusing on listening to his driving instructor, and also managing kind of like the motor skills. So he's in cognitive overload. That therefore means that when you try to kind of like put another kind of verbal task on top of that, such as listening to music or having a conversation, you wouldn't be able to do it because he's at the absolute peak of his cognitive abilities according to the working memory model. And the bit of his memory specifically that's overloaded is his central executive. His central executive is not going to be able to deal with all of that information coming in at once. What would managing motor skills be under if working memory and auditory and visual? It's not. It's more to do with the central executive. That is one bit of the working memory model that is naff. It doesn't bear any attention to that. So that is a criticism. But don't worry about that, Lauren. You don't need to know that. The point of that exam question was that for one of them, it was a procedural skill. So his central executive can deal with the demands. For the other one, it can't deal with the demands. There's too much cognitive demand on him. So the central executive has got to prioritise. That therefore means he can't listen to what the driving instructor is saying and listen to music or hold a separate conversation. Right, good. Okay, so with that question answered then, if we're all good to go, I'm going to go straight into eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony, obviously it's split into two separate bits. You got misleading information and you've got the effects of anxiety. So for misleading information, it's all just research. Misleading information, you've got your two major bits of research, both experimental in nature, one about misleading questions, one about post-event discussion. So the Loftus and Palmer study is a classic piece of research, independent measures design. So obviously you've got participant variability. Also, they were all university students, so you can go on about demand characteristics if you wanted to. They're likely to have known the aim. But the basic premise was watch a video of a car accident, split your participants up into 5 separate conditions, manipulate the word that you use to describe, the verb, not just a word, the verb you use to describe the impact of the crash, and then see what effect it has on the dependent variable, which was their recollection or their estimate of how fast the cars were going. So your 5 conditions are smashed, hit, collided, contacted, and bumped. So those were your conditions. You only really need to know the top and bottom estimate. I mean, if you do learn the other ones, you're really pushing it. So I know I've personally got a few students who will be stretching their limits and trying to remember all 5, but I would always just advise you to know the top and the bottom. And a really easy way to remember it is that there's a 9 mile an hour, I'm not Northern Irish, 9 miles an hour difference between the top and the bottom estimate. So the top estimate for smashed was 41, with the bottom estimate at 32 for contacted. So yeah, those findings are really easy to remember. Please, if you can't hack it, don't try and remember all those other findings, because if I'm totally honest, I wouldn't know those other Loftus and Palmer findings off the top of my head. That's why I always just tell you lot to know those 2. I think in the booklet it's just those 2 that are highlighted. So that's Loftus and Palmer. I think you'll agree, nice and straightforward to describe there. The Gabbert study is a bit more wiffly waffly, there's a bit more to say, but it was investigating post-event discussion. So they watched a simulated crime, but it was an independent measures design. So they were shown different versions of the crime. So some people saw things that other participants could not see. off the top of my head, it was a book. I think it was a title of a book and a handbag that one of the perps was carrying. I don't even know whether we mentioned the handbag in the handbooks that we gave you, but we definitely mentioned that one of the participants could see a title of a book and the other one could not. So then you've got an independent measures design, but what you're doing is you are bringing participants together in one condition who were allowed to have post-event discussion, and then in the second condition you kept them apart, so there was no post-event discussion. So in the condition where there was a post-event discussion between a participant who had seen one version of the crime and a participant who had seen the second version of the crime, who had seen certain things that the other person had not, there was inaccurate recall from 71% of participants. So when they were given post-event discussion, 71% of participants recalled seeing something that they had not seen, and it was impossible because in the version of the crime that they had witnessed, they couldn't see the title of that book. When there was no post-event discussion, there was 0% inaccurate recall. So they didn't recall seeing things because obviously they hadn't seen it in the first place. So that is a absolutely brilliant finding, and it makes it crystal clear that post-event discussion can fabricate someone's memory and make them believe that they have seen something which in fact they have not. So it's got real world applications, has the Gabbert study, because you don't want witnesses talking to one another after they've seen a crime, because the evidence would become tainted. Now that I don't think is in your evaluation point, but that is certainly a practical applications point that you could go with if you ever got stuck, that you should not allow witnesses to talk to one another post-event, because their evidence, the source of evidence, will all just get muddled up. It's the same thing when you're considering the effectiveness of a jury. You shouldn't let the jury see kind of like news sources, because it'll skew what they hear in the courtroom, because you are affected by what the people say. So that's post-event discussion. Again, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself here, but that's what you lot should be doing. Whenever you're evaluating anything from memory, it's just the same old evaluation points that you just keep wheeling out. It's ecological validity in its mundane realism. The people who will get the best marks are the ones who apply it the best. So I'm always saying this in my classroom. If you just say cognitive research or eyewitness testimony research is low in ecological validity because it's artificial and it took place in a lab, it will get 0. It will get nothing. If you actually criticise the piece of research that you have talked about in your AO1, then it will get everything. So if you can correctly say that Loftus and Palmer's research was low in mundane realism because they saw a video of a car crash, which is not the same as witnessing a real life car accident, because in real life scenarios there would be anxiety, panic and fear experienced by real witnesses, which would further skew their judgment. So therefore it's not reflective of accuracy of memory in real life. So you can always use that point. Obviously for eyewitness testimony research in general, you've got the 2 practical application points. So one is that it has made huge changes in the judicial system. So now all common law practice is that you are no longer entitled to gain a conviction just by hearsay, i.e. an eyewitness statement. There's got to be some other either corroborating evidence, forensic evidence or CCTV evidence. So that's one practical app. The second practical app is that it led to the development of the cognitive interview. So because Elizabeth Loftus had proved time and time again, and she's still battling on publishing research, because she proved that misleading questions are so damaging and that memory is so fallible to to accuracy, then you need to eliminate misleading questions from any police interviews. So if any of you have had a police interview recently, they won't really ask you any specific questions. It's very much a lot of kind of like, can you just tell me what you saw? Can you tell me what you think you witnessed? Now, I'm getting a 20-second warning here, so that therefore means I think that I've done an hour. So I want to get to the end of eyewitness testimony, so I'm going to cut it off, but I will come straight back online again and do a further 10 minutes, all right, and try and wrap that up for you. So this is going to cut off, but I'll go straight back and finish eyewitness testimony.